Hi, welcome to part 2 of our Talks on Tap series for 2020, Facing Ourselves, Discussions on Civil Discourse. My name is Leslie Higgins, Director of Education for the United States Marshals Museum, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Malcolm Glover. Dr. Glover's presentation is entitled The Common Good, Building Cultural Capacity in Arkansas, America, and Beyond. We've all been at home for several weeks now practicing our social distancing, but parts of the country are starting to open back up. People are going back to work, and we're going to be around each other a little more than we have been recently. We all have our ideas and opinions about how this should go, but I think there's one thing that we can all agree on, and that is the need for civility as we go through this transition, to think about how we talk to each other, how we treat each other as our country goes through this unique period in our history. As you watch tonight's presentation, I hope that you'll think about your community and how you can promote the common good where you are. Now, this series is called Talks on Tap, so I hope as you enjoy the presentation, you'll sit back and relax and enjoy your favorite beverage. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for your support of and interest in the United States Marshals Museum. Enjoy.
Hello, I'm Dr. Malcolm Glover. Thank you for attending this Talk on Tap. I hope by the end of our session, you'll have a better understanding of civil discourse, what it means for all of us as individuals, and what it could mean for our communities. For nearly 20 years, I've traveled the world helping people solve problems. And in all my interactions, I do believe that we must first look within and understand ourselves before we can face others and truly engage to find sustainable solutions to our problems. This session is titled The Common Good, Building Cultural Capacity in Arkansas, America, and Beyond. And I hope that from my travels and from my experiences, all of you will have a better understanding of what it will take to raise the level of civil discourse in our communities. In order to understand this topic, we must first gain a better understanding of civil discourse. And so we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about cultural capacity, what it will take to build it, and what it will take for us to engage with others who don't worship the way we do, talk the way we do, come from the backgrounds that we come from, but recognizing that from those differences, we can truly make sustainable changes in society. Then we'll talk about community engagement, how we get others on board to solve problems. All of those topics, from civil discourse to cultural capacity to community engagement, should lead us to the common good. Now more than ever before, this session is important. Many of you have looked on television, read in the newspaper, looked in magazines at all of the different issues and problems that impact our society. As we think about life here in Arkansas, across our nation, and around the world, we've seen scenes of social unrest, concerns about policing, protests breaking out in communities from sea to shining sea. Those concerns are evident. But we also have to think beyond just those issues of social unrest and think about the economic distress that also exists. Besides economic distress, there are also health crises that in so many instances have families concerned about the way forward for themselves and for everyone else. Adequately handle so many of these different issues, we must first think about what it takes to communicate with one another. So let's first look at civil discourse. Now, scholars have argued for many years that there are a variety of different definitions for civil discourse. As I said before, this evening, we'll think about civil discourse through the lens of culture. So before we get to that point, let's think about what Abraham Lincoln had to say in his second inaugural. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness and right as God gives us to see the right. We must think about those things if we are going to do our best to bridge the divides in our communities. So if we think about civil discourse through a cultural lens, we recognize that civil discourse is about engagement and conversation in order to enhance understanding. It is an opportunity to create space for collaboration. Civil discourse is more than that. In order to have civil conversations, we must think about what it will take for us to gather together, for us to discuss concerns, and for us to listen to one another. Because it is through those that we really can make a meaningful difference. Now, as we go through the different topics this evening, one thing I want you to know is that I want us to not only talk about these issues, but I want to leave you with some helpful hints, some tips, tools, and strategies for you to raise the level of civil discourse in your community. When I think about the topic of civil discourse, I think about some of the work that I had an opportunity to do with the Kettering Foundation. Now, the Kettering Foundation is a nonpartisan institution. Their whole objective is to have conversations in communities, to listen to what people have to say, to bring citizens together and ask them, what will it take to make democracy work as it should? And so as I worked with the Kettering Foundation in different communities across the country, we held different forums. These forums were all about deliberative democracy, public deliberation, the understanding that in order to raise the level of civil and intellectual discourse in our communities, we have to bring people together once again. Not just in the standard old town hall meeting format where people come into a room and then they listen to a panel of experts and all they get to do is ask certain questions, but bringing people together in a room to talk about their own personal experiences, about key issues that are of concern for them, their families, and their communities. And from that sharing of concerns, seeing if there's any common ground, any strategies for moving forward. Public deliberation matters. And so, as I said before, one of the things that I want us to do in this session is have some tips, tools, and strategies for success. So if you would like to raise the level of civil discourse at home, on the job, in the community, in this nation and across the world, well, I want you to think about these ground rules for meaningful conversations that are currently on the screen. When you bring diverse groups of people together and you have to have a crucial conversation, sometimes those conversations can be difficult. And it's important on the front end to set key ground rules so that everyone remains on the same page. Everyone has buy-in to those ground rules. You'll see some of these ground rules on your screen right now, but I want you to pay close attention to that final key point. Though the standard ground rules that are currently up there, like everyone being encouraged to participate, not letting any one or two people dominate the conversation, remember that last point. Encourage participants to set additional rules. This gets extra buy-in from anyone who's participating in the crucial conversation. They can think of things that may not have already been listed in those ground rules, and now that they have buy-in, they have skin in the game, they can hold each other accountable so that as we have a conversation, everyone is on the same page and we move irresistibly toward finding sustainable solutions. Beyond civil discourse, If we're going to look at the topic in a holistic way, we have to think about cultural capacity. I think no greater leader than Dr. John Garang de Mabor is an example of what it takes to build cultural capacity after years of civil war between Sudan and South Sudan. There's this phenomenal quote by Dr. John Garang where he says, "Let us unite against ethnic, religious, and racial divides to restore personal dignity for all." I think that's something that we have to do each and every day if we're going to bring people together to solve uncommon problems. When I think about cultural capacity, I think of it as building new processes that take into consideration all of our differences. It is the thoughtful creation of space and society for individuals to develop competencies that in many ways promote equity, inclusion, and diversity. Now, if we're going to do those things, we have to understand that there are cultural norms that exist. And in order to bring us closer together during trying times, we have to recognize that understanding people who are different from us takes time, it takes energy, and it's going to take a lot of talent. One of the reasons why I brought up the quote from Dr. John Garang is because I had the pleasure of doing some humanitarian aid work in South Sudan. This was in the early 2000s, not too long after decades of civil war in that new country. And as I went from community to community, from Juba to Rumbek, and even spending some time in Kenya at the Kakuma refugee camp, where there were many people from the diaspora community in South Sudan living there, I realized how important it is to take some time to work on development projects. Outreach is important when you're trying your best to understand those who may be different from you. I think of one incident in Juba, in South Sudan. At that time, it was the capital city of South Sudan. And one of the jobs that I had to do was to film communities as they tried to rebuild. At that time, I was in the Nimera Talata community in Juba in South Sudan. And as I was filming, watching people go about their daily lives, one of the interesting things that happened were people were shocked to see me recording their community. An incident ended up occurring because people didn't know who I was. I wasn't from that community. They wanted to know why I was there. And as they surrounded me, I, of course, got concerned. You know, I'm a foreigner in a foreign land. I didn't know the language. But all I could do was show through my body language that I was only there to help. Luckily for me, a good Samaritan came by who knew both Juban Arabic and English, and he was able to diffuse the situation. But I learned during that experience that what was so concerning to those people was not only that I was an outsider, but that I was recording them going about their daily lives. The government of Sudan did a lot of recording of villages during the Civil War. And after those villages were recorded, in many instances, those villages were later burned. And so my presence as an outsider there was of deep concern. It worried many of the locals. I bring up this story to remind us that sometimes we don't understand the experiences of others who are different from us, but we have to be willing to hear them out. We have to have body language that helps us diffuse situations that we don't understand. And we have to be willing to reason with those who disagree with us. Which brings us to another essential element for our toolkit. Here you'll find some strategies for brave and authentic conversations. When in doubt, listen with empathy. Compassion is key in so many instances. Also, be willing to tell your story. I think so many times we think of, do I have all the facts? And if I don't have all the facts, then I can't engage in a meaningful conversation with someone. But by telling your story, what you're really doing is letting your guard down and letting someone else in so they can get to know who you are. That also creates a culture of transparency for the individual and possibly even for the organizations that you work for. I want you to encourage healthy discourse, and there are some strategies there to do that, and always emphasize accountability. It matters. Recognize that if you've done wrong, then you have to hold yourself accountable, your organization accountable for your actions or your inactions in order to rebuild trust with those you serve. As we move through our list from civil discourse to cultural capacity, let's talk more about community engagement. Now, as I said before, we're taking a look at the idea of civil discourse through the lens of different cultures, places that I've traveled, and some of what I've learned from people with different ideologies, different perspectives, different points of view. I think we can learn from everyone. And so now we have a quote on our screen from Chairman Mao Zedong. And he says that we should encourage comrades to take the interests of the whole into account. Take the interests of the whole into account. Everything that we do, every statement, every action must proceed from thinking about the whole. When I think of community engagement, I think of it as a process where individuals and institutions work collaboratively. Community engagement can take many forms, and it can come in many patterns. It can include organized groups, neighborhoods, agencies, institutions, or individuals. Some of you may even call community engagement outreach, stakeholder relations. But if your objective is to raise the level of civil discourse in society, no matter whether you're in the public or private sectors, whether you work for a government agency or a nonprofit, you have to think about how you engage with community, whether that's in person, one-on-one, to small groups, or using technology like we're doing right here to bring people in, to tell a story, to educate, encourage, and inspire. When I think of effective community engagement, I know that we have to see that it has a social function, an economic function, an educational function, a political function, and it deals with environmental factors as well. Community engagement cannot operate if we only work in silos, talking to those we feel comfortable with, not bringing the outside in. If we're going to build sustainable solutions to problems, we have to do outreach. We talked about Mao Zedong, and I have to tell you that my experience in the People's Republic of China was transformative. As a participant in Admiral William Crowell's international mission on diplomacy, I had opportunities to go to Beijing, Xi'an, and Shanghai. My sole objective was research and networking, not only with low-level government officials there in China, but also with student leaders, to find out how they view themselves and their government and what matters most to them in community. I didn't always agree with their perspectives or points of view, but I was willing to listen. I was willing to engage. I was willing to learn about their history, their culture, and grow from that experience. I can remember visiting historic sites like the Temple of Heaven, the terracotta warriors and soldiers, walking with locals on the Great Wall of China. All of those experiences transformed me, gave me a better understanding of the people, so I could no longer think about them as the other or an ideology that I may not agree with based on my American upbringing, but as human beings who have a different experience based on where they live, how they were raised, and what they value. So let's get some more essentials for our toolkit. In order to be effective in community engagement, we have to think about our own emotional intelligence. We have to be self-aware. So here are some key questions that I think you should answer for yourself. If your objective is to raise the level of civil discourse on the job, at home, in the community, in the state that you live in this nation or around the world, well, think about when interacting with others, what response do you actually elicit? Do you engender respect or fear, trust or suspicion when you're engaging with others? And in diverse settings, do you operate in an inclusive manner? Or do you only surround yourselves with people who think the way you do, who come from where you come from? If your objective is to build solutions for the entire community, you have to ask these crucial questions. You have to be emotionally intelligent. You have to be self-aware in order to bring others in. If we consider civil discourse, our cultural capacity, and community engagement, if we think about those elements that are in our toolkit, it can bring us closer to the common good. Which reminds me of this quote by Justice Sonia Sotomayor on the U.S. Supreme Court. And she says, "Always my first question is, what is the goal? And then who must be persuaded if it is to be accomplished?" Think about that. What is your goal? And who do you need to persuade in order to accomplish that goal? If you are concerned about raising the level of civil discourse, if you believe we live in tumultuous times, then you have to think about the goals that you have and what it will take to get people on the same page. And so here on your screen is how I define the common good. There are a variety of different definitions out there, but I believe the common good is an important philosophical concept. It is the understanding of what it takes for us to have shared values and shared benefits for everyone in our communities, no matter where they come from, no matter their socioeconomic status. The common good is about collective action and active participation in our society. Now, some key examples of civility and the common good is recognizing what it will take for there to be a just legal and political system, recognizing what it will take for us to have effective public policy. It's about what it will take for peace among all nations and among all races. As you look at these slides, you may say to yourself, well, my goodness, to reach the common good takes a lot of work. You may think about where we are right now and how far we have to go to reach some of those key elements. But I would say our objective as people who want to raise the level of civil discourse in our societies is to do what it takes to start traveling down that road, recognizing that everything won't happen in a day or a week, or sometimes even a decade. But if our goals are just, then it means a lot for us to work towards those goals. And one of the things that I can say is that the U.S. Marshals Service has always been at the forefront of expanding opportunity and civility in the United States of America. We can see it in the work of so many different former marshals, like the work of Frederick Douglass, who early on in his life was an abolitionist before becoming a marshal in the District of Columbia. We can also see it through the pioneering work of women like Catherine Battle Gordy, who was a trailblazer for women in law enforcement, and through her work recognized the importance of being someone there to be a repairer of the breach. And we can, of course, see it through the work of James J.P. McShane, a chief United States Marshal during another tumultuous time in U.S. history, who worked to ensure the safety of the Freedom Riders, who worked to make sure that James Meredith could integrate Ole Miss, who did his best to protect those who were marching with Martin Luther King Jr. from Selma to Montgomery. All of the work of the U.S. Marshals shows us how important it is to think about the common good and do whatever we can, however we can, in whatever capacity to make sure that we expand civility, that we raise the level of civil discourse, and that we promote the common good, no matter where we work, how we work, or who we surround ourselves with. And so let's get to some more essentials for our toolkit, because it's not enough to talk about it. We have to have tips, tools, and strategies so that we can be about it in our daily lives. So here are some leadership strategies for inclusive practice. Think about your intention and your purpose. Know what you want through mindful self-reflection. Think about how you engage with others. Develop habits or create mechanisms that promote collaboration. Then you have to enact what you've been working on. Act on your ideas. Recognize that some things will work and some things won't. But the objective should be to always invite outside stakeholders to help you make your strategies better. Recognizing that those outside ideas allow you to communicate with others more, connect with others more, collaborate in order to raise the level of civil discourse and promote the common good. And then, of course, you have to be willing to assess everything that you've done. Assess the strategies that you've worked on. Have things worked? Do things need to change? Can we do something a little bit different? That feedback matters. That feedback matters. And it matters however you get it. Whether it's face-to-face engagement, whether it's engagement online, anything that helps you understand others can help you make a change. Fundamentally, this is what I believe. If you want to raise the level of civil discourse in our society, it can only be done by effective communication. It's not enough for us to keep our ideas to ourselves. We have to be willing, in some way, shape, or form, to talk to one another, to reason with one another, to listen to one another. It will also take compassion. This may sound trite, but you have to be willing to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Recognize that the way you were raised might not be the way someone else was raised, and that their experiences matter too, even though you might not see things the exact same way. In order to raise the level of civil discourse, we have to have confidence. If we shrink from the challenge, if we shirk our responsibilities, then things will not change. Things will not get better. In order to raise the level of civil discourse in our society, we must have courage. We must have courage. Courage can come through challenging others, asking the tough questions, doing things differently, and engaging with people we never engaged with before. Fundamentally, I believe that in order to raise the level of civil discourse in our society, in times of great uncertainty, we have to commit ourselves to the cause of peace. We have to understand that fairness, decency, and truth are the only balms that can heal our nation's ancient wounds and create a just society. In order to raise the level of civil discourse, it takes you and it takes me. We are the ones who can improve the human condition. But we have to face ourselves before we can engage with others. It is my sincere hope that as we think about this topic of civil discourse, looking at it through a cultural lens, we recognize that the only way we can build capacity is by having certain skills, tips, tools, and strategies that will help us make a difference. It takes us all having a little bit of personal courage to move forward so that we can irresistibly move closer to the common good. I'm Dr. Malcolm Glover. I want to thank all of you for participating in this session. If at any time you want to engage with me after this session is over, feel free to go to my website. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have as we continue our session or even after this session. I think that it's very important during these times that we have crucial conversations that can help us make a difference at our homes, on our jobs, in our communities, in this nation, and around the world. Thank you so very much. Questions. I love questions. I'm looking forward to some of them. And hopefully I'll have some answers for you. Absolutely. I'll repeat it.
My question is, given everything that's happening right now, it's just odd that this is so timely. Given the nature of what you've just presented, is there something that you can think of the next best step as a country that we can start taking in our own lives?
Thank you for the question. So for the audience, the first question is this. Given everything that's going on in the country right now, and to add to the question, the backdrop of protests, because as we have this session, there are protests happening right now all across our nation, from Washington, D.C., to Little Rock, to Milwaukee, to Los Angeles. I believe, as a matter of fact, over the weekend, over 24 cities in the United States have had protests. And outside of even those protests, some of the other things that we've mentioned in terms of those protests in terms of policing and other concerns, but then also some of the socioeconomic concerns and health concerns in our nation. What is a good next step, particularly at a time when things seem so dire and the tension has been ratcheted up so much in the country? I think one of the key first steps, if we think about it at a grand scale, is that our leaders have to work in a way that brings down the temperature. One of the ways that can be done is by being conveners. I think conversations matter. And we have so many technologies now that allow us to have those meaningful conversations, and it would be helpful for leaders, not only at the federal level, but at the state and local level, to engage in those conversations with different communities about what those concerns are and how some of those concerns might be addressed. I think at a personal level, I think we as individuals have to be willing to listen with a third ear, see with a third eye, and recognize that though we may see things differently, hear things differently, though we might not have the experiences that others have had, what they're saying, how they feel, what they've experienced actually matters in some way, shape, or form. And so it should not be our place as individuals to be combative. It should be our place to listen and then help each other move to higher ground. And so we have to think about what are those strategies that can help us, first of all, have crucial conversations, but then, of course, get on one accord so we can bring about sustainable solutions. So I would say, first of all, it takes having a conversation. It takes having a conversation, and even if that's a personal conversation with family members and friends, to think about, or to at least hear what they think about these situations, but then to expand beyond that point. Think about your institution. What can your institution do? Is it a museum? You know, like the Marshals Museum, they're having these crucial conversations on civil discourse. It's something that in some small way can help move us forward. Other agencies might find other things to do in terms of outreach and engagement to help heal some of those wounds. And then, of course, there are the other things that we have to think about. Things like concrete legislation that in many ways deal with equity, that changes the way we view some of our social norms, that can also be of help. But having conversations, I think, are key to success, starting off and then moving from conversation to actual strategy and action.
We have a question from Pat 94. What do you think is missing most the way we communicate, and how do we diffuse perceived extreme viewpoints when we try to engage?
Okay. So the question is, what do I think we're missing most when we communicate? And what do we need to diffuse? I believe it was. How do we diffuse? How do we diffuse perceived extreme viewpoints? Okay. So I believe what we're missing most when we communicate with one another is listening. I think that that might sound very simple, but I think it's something that we do not do. And let me add to that. We listen to respond rather than listen to understand. I think most times, particularly when we're having difficult conversations with others that we may not agree with, we're just waiting. We're waiting to jump in, to give that counterpoint. It's like point, counterpoint. Instead of listening to understand why that individual feels the way that they do. What is it about their life experience, their upbringing, that makes them have that point of view? You know, it gets to one of the points we talked about earlier in the session about being willing to allow someone to tell their story, and you being willing to tell your story. Because once we tell our personal stories, that kind of takes the conversation to a different stage. It's no longer about just ideological differences or political differences or social differences or racial differences. It's more about, this is who I am. This is what I bring to the table, but I also want to understand who you are and what you're bringing to the table. The second part to that question was what, again, when we're in those difficult conversations, how we diffuse them. So let me say this. It's not easy diffusing difficult conversations. It's not. And I say that as someone who is a certified conflict mediator, who has experience in facilitation and negotiating difficult agreements between parties here in the United States and even in war-torn countries. I think the first thing that you have to tell yourself is that there's a strong possibility that at the end of this difficult conversation, hearts and minds will not be changed. But I want to get back to what I mentioned earlier in that story where I talked about my experiences in South Sudan. I think you have to know yourself. You have to show through your demeanor, through your attitude and your actions, your behavior, your body language, your tone of voice, that you're ready, willing, and able to listen to that. You're ready, willing, and able to allow them to express themselves, but you also have to be willing to tell them, now please let me express myself and why I have a difference of opinion. I think we should never enter any negotiation, any conflict, any major disagreement, thinking that we're going to change someone's mind or that they will change our mind. We should enter it trying to hear out the other party. That's why if you didn't have a chance to write it down, I know that they're going to be uploading this session at a later date. It would be helpful to look back at the toolkit and look back at that section where we talked about certain ground rules. You know, if you're going to have a tough conversation, a crucial conversation with someone, whether it's on your job or in your home, you know, or in the community, and you know that you just really don't see eye to eye with this individual, sometimes, as hokey as it may sound, it may be helpful to set out some ground rules, you know? And after you've both set out those ground rules, say, hey, what else do you think should be added to this? Because I want to make sure that you know that I want to respect your opinion and your point of view, and I also want you to respect mine. So what would you like to add so that we can honor these rules as we have this tough conversation and recognize that by the end of it, even though we may not see eye to eye, the true thing is that by having that conversation, we've come a little bit closer. I can no longer see you just as the other because we've actually talked with one another. And you may have opened my eyes to why you feel the way that you do, even though you may not change and I may not change. That is just as important. So fundamentally, I would say set some ground rules, but recognize that you can have a better chance of reaching a desired result by listening to understand rather than listening to respond, and also by showing through your demeanor, through your body language, through your eye contact, and through your tone of voice that you actually care about what that person has to say, even if you don't agree with that individual.
Another staff question. What suggestions do you have for organizations that are interested in doing programming based around civil discourse and building community?
So for organizations, the question is, what are some ideas for organizations who are interested in doing programming around civil discourse and building community? I would say that it's very important, particularly if you've never done it before and you might feel like, oh my gosh, we want to do this. This sounds great, but we don't really know where to start. I would say don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes some of the best things to do is start off by looking at what you already do. Sometimes one of the best ways to build community and raise the level of civil discourse is just to engage with community. So as an organization, think about what you do. And depending on what you do, if there are components of that deal with outreach, then figure out ways that you can beef up those programs, expand those programs, invite others in, or engage with others to make some of those programs better. Also, too, when I say you don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel, recognize that not to promote certain businesses, but recognize that Google or Bing can be your friend. You know, go to whatever search engine you like and type in, civil discourse programs, community engagement programs. There are a variety of different organizations out there that have some downloadable exercises that you might be able to use that can then help you do what you want to do without feeling like you have to start from scratch. So there are two pillars, I would say. First, look at what you already do and figure out if there are ways that you can engage with the community more. Because sometimes recognize that in your organization or in your institution, no matter how great your staff may be, no one has all the ideas. And sometimes by inviting the outside in, we get some of our greatest inspiration. So invite the outside in, but then also recognize that you don't have to create a curriculum from scratch. There are some great things out there online that you can use and then implement in order to do some better outreach and community engagement. And I would also say, always keep your eyes open. The way I ended up having this phenomenal opportunity with the U.S. Marshals Museum is that I was engaged in another community project with one of the employees from the Marshals Museum. And, she recognized, this guy is really engaged in doing projects and programs in community. And if we're going to have this series on civil discourse, because of some of the work that he's done, he might end up being an asset to some of the programs that we want to do. And so I guess the honorable mention to those two pillars would be always see opportunities as you engage with others. Recognize that that might be a way for you to bring the community in, and someone else can create some programs and opportunities for your organization. Let's see. Okay. So that was the last question. I have to admit, I really enjoy questions, and I've really enjoyed this opportunity. I'd like to thank the U.S. Marshals Museum for hosting me. It's been a pleasure. I know these are difficult times, but I do believe that we have to face ourselves if we're going to raise the level of civil discourse and truly engage in community in a way that helps us build the common good. I'm Dr. Malcolm Glover. Thank you all very much.